how do you heal abandonment trauma? Abandonment trauma is one of the biggest things that drives us in terms of our core wounds. It's probably, I would say, the largest wound because it's a subconscious feeling. Like this feeling is living at the back of your head all the time that someone's going to leave you or you're going to be alone. And so when you have this, like this trauma that like, you know, there is trauma from it because of various wounds. So there's the abandonment wound is the biggest feeling. That wound is what tells you all the time that you're most likely going to be alone. People are going to most likely leave you. Now, remember when I told you as the child, if the child believes that people are going to leave me or I'm going to be alone, then the child also believes that I'm not lovable enough that someone would want to show up for me. I'm not lovable enough that someone would want to really build a relationship or keep a relationship with me. And so that child, the inner child that's driving you, now starts to have a depreciated sense of self-worth, starts to have a feeling of like longiness, loneliness, starts to have a feeling of not being able to connect with enough with people. And the largest thing is self-sabotaging relationships, because this is what's crazy. When we have a strong abandonment wound, we'll get into a relationship which is actually working out, which is actually working pretty well. But because of our fear is so strongly telling us that, listen, you're always going to be alone, we start to make that happen. We start to make it come true because that's the belief is that we're going to be alone, right? Anything we believe we will make true. That is the basic premise of the human experience. And so in that space, even when you're in a good relationship, you will subconsciously, when it starts to go well, you'll start questioning it. You'll start doubting your partner. You'll start doubting yourself. Maybe even you'll step into patterns which are not really good for the relationship, either infidelity or lack of communication, all kinds of things. That's a big thing that comes from abandonment, like having an abandonment wound or trauma. One of the other things that shows up from having an abandonment wound or trauma is what people call being like clingy or needy or being over dependent, because we're so afraid that someone is going to leave us that what we want to do now is we want to hold on to them with whatever way we can. So we step into what we call survival programs. Most likely we'll step into what's called the fawning response, where we'll try and people please as much as we can. We'll try and make sure our partner can be the happiest person in the world. We'll try and do everything for somebody else. We'll try and like stretch ourselves and abandon ourselves because we'd much rather have someone show up for us than for us to show up for ourselves. And that's important to know, because it's important to recognize, because someone in our life left us at some point before. So it's more important that we try and have someone else to fit that role than for us to fit that role. That's our belief system. And so with abandonment trauma especially, or with an abandonment wound. So abandonment trauma comes from actually experiencing the trauma of that. So having a parent, having left, having had a partner who's left us later on in life. But that's basically a reflection of that same belief system. Having had someone who died really early, any of those things can lead us with that feeling of the abandonment trauma, which leads to the abandonment wound. Now, remember what I said, almost all of us have an abandonment wound, but the wound is ultimately what drives us. So what we need to do in the reparenting, as you asked us, how do you heal this trauma? What we need to really do with this reparenting aspect is to understand, how can I show up for myself consistently? How can I show up for myself in the present moment and with love for my inner child consistently, so that I can show myself that I'm worthy of being showed up for? So the first thing it involves is going back to that moment of trauma. So let's say, for example, when a dad left or a mom left, recognizing what did the child feel at that moment. They felt really fucking sad. They felt so alone. They felt that someone wasn't able to really show up for them. They felt that the person they loved the most left them in life. And so, who's going to be here? And so in that moment, recognizing the wounded child, and then recognizing us in the present, and through various, this is what we do theta level meditations. So through those meditations, going to that child and providing the opposite of what they're feeling. So providing security, providing love, providing this feeling like I'll be here for you always. And this comes in through the meditations. This comes through different things like mirror work. This comes through journaling. This comes through different things where we're actually consciously now stepping into that place of giving that inner child the love, security, and safety they really want. And so when we do that, this child now starts to feel a little more soothed. And remember what I told you, this child is the engine inside of you. This wounded child is what's creating the belief system that you have, which is driving your like order, which is what's driving who you are today. And so when you step in that place of providing that child with that security and love and protection, they start to feel a little more, like I said, soothed. They start to feel a little more safe, and they start to feel a little more grounded. Now, this has to be a continuous process, and there's two ways you do it. One is through the act of going to the past, through the meditations, and the other is by validating that, by committing to yourself in the present moment. So by creating, the thing about people who have a lot of abandonment trauma, abandonment wounds, is that self-abandonment is one of the strongest traits that we have for ourselves. So what that shows up is like not necessarily having a routine, not having structure in our lives, not being able to commit to things, not being able to show up for ourselves in certain ways. So let's say, for example, we say, okay, I want to be committed to this, like this routine. I want to be committed to my health. I want to grow and like, you know, eat better, sleep better, blah, blah, blah. But after 2 days, we give it up and we get back into those old habits. And that's a pattern. So in those moments, we have to create a more disciplined structure for ourselves, because by doing that in the present, you're now saying, I am valuable enough that I can make the sacrifice, the compromise, or the commitment to show up for myself. So it's two things. It's not just going into the past and like reparenting the inner child and then going and just like lazing on the couch 24/7 and not doing anything about it. It's the combination of going into the past, loving that inner child, especially around their wounds. So that moment when, for example, something I used to do for myself, I had a huge feeling of like the same abandonment trauma, especially with my mom. And something I used to do for myself is I used to go back to those moments when I felt like I wanted my mom to lift me up, to hug me, to care for me. Even when I was going off to boarding school, to say, I love you, I don't want you to go. And I would visualize me as my present self being that mother and picking up my little self. And I would visualize hugging him and holding him like a mother would, with that like expression of feminine energy and care. And in that process of giving that child what that child really wanted, I started to feel a little more secure, and I started to not depend on this from my partners. So I would notice that when my sense of security was low, especially with an abandonment wound, what happens is we start to get really like clingy. We start to like reach out way too much. We start to like text so much. We get really insecure about when they're not texting us back. We start to depend on them. This is the biggest one. We start to depend on them to regulate our emotions. So if we're feeling sad or angry or whatever, we're like, babe, I'm feeling really sad, like, you know, make me feel better. Or like, you know, babe, I did this, you didn't really help me with this or respond to this, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, well, I was doing my shit. Or how do you expect me to do that? Because we don't want to do it for ourselves. Where, like I said, that principle of self-abandonment is so big. We don't want to do it for ourselves because we don't even believe we're capable of doing it for ourselves. So it's being able to provide that love to ourselves, the inner child, because then you start in those moments where you feel dysregulated, you say, okay, what is a routine I can build for myself? Every time I find that I'm emotionally dysregulated, I'm not going to go out, I'm going to go in. That's the biggest thing of like the someone who has abandonment trauma. It's like, okay, I'm going to go in. Now, what do I do when I go in? I create a breath work routine. I'm going to sit with myself for 5 minutes and practice box breathing. So here's something you guys can all Google. This is an amazing breath work that you can actually use to be able to regulate your nervous system in moments when you get really, you feel like triggered or traumatized, etc. So by doing this, you're now calming your nervous system down yourself. You're not expecting your boyfriend or girlfriend to come give you a hug. You're not expecting a parent to come validate you. You're able to regulate your nervous system yourself and say, I'm here, relax, calm down, all is good. And by you doing the box breathing and doing that, your inner child is now noticing, holy shit, you're actually starting to show up for me. You're actually starting to be here. Okay, give me more. Now, the more you show up for yourself in those ways, the more you show up for yourselves in the present when you're feeling dysregulated or your emotions are feeling all right, when you need to go for a walk, the more you have a routine for yourself in the present and also revisit those moments in the past, the more that your child starts, the inner child starts to feel secure, the less they feel abandoned. Because why? Abandonment is the feeling that someone's going to leave me and no one's going to show up. But now you're doing the opposite. Now you're showing up every single goddamn day. This is why, you know, people ask a lot of the time, like, how do the most successful people on the planet, like all these, like Tony Robbins and all of these guys, you know, what have they done that's so phenomenal? You know, these people don't feel any pain. They're so impervious to like trauma. No, that's not true. They actually feel so much of it. But because they know what they've gone through and they know they have to show up for themselves, they have such a disciplined routine. That's why the routine is so important, is because it's a version of showing yourself you are so worthy that I will commit to your growth. Another thing with people who have abandonment wounds, how much will we show up for other people, other partners, other friends, like primarily in relationships and in partner relationships? Will we show up for them so that what they need is taken care of? We'll make sure they're feeling good. We'll make sure we cook for them. We'll make sure we make their life easy. How much are we willing to show up for them? But how much are we really willing to show up for ourselves? Barely any. And that's because of that feeling that we don't deserve it. So going back to the child and saying you do deserve it and you love it, and like being able to like sense those little wounds when you were a kid and reparenting yourself around those, and reparenting yourself in the present moment by giving yourself more like love, giving yourself more commitment, conscious like commitment in this moment to routine, all of that. The combination of those start to say you are fucking worthy. No, you are motherfucking worthy. You are so valuable because I'm showing up for you. That here's what happens. You refuse to settle for relationships where someone is not going to show up for you. Why? Because you have now set a standard for yourself. By you showing up for yourself, by you setting a standard for yourself of saying, I deserve this treatment that I'm going to give myself, you will not be able to attract a relationship where someone doesn't give this to you. Because you have a standard of how you deserve to be treated. So any of the other guys or girls who came into your life that they would abandon you, they'd ghost you, they treat you good and then withdraw so that you validated those old beliefs, you're like, fuck off. That's not going to have any space here anymore because I deserve someone to treat me well. I'm treating myself so goddamn well, so I deserve them to treat me well. That's basically, you know, the shortest way I could put it in. But remember, it takes time. This is a wound that has followed you for decades, and that is a wound that was built so heavily in such a big trauma. So for you to ultimately be able to let it go, it will take you this continuous aspect of showing up for yourself.